Hello, and welcome to our second lecture covering animal anatomy and physiology. In this lecture, we'll be covering the circulatory and respiratory system, and this is chapter 22 in your textbook. There are some major perks to being a small or unicellular or very flat organism. And one of the major benefits to this is that when you want to undergo gas exchange or remove your waste, you can simply diffuse it past your cell membrane or past your tissues into the media around you. And so some examples can be seen like flatworms or unicellular eukaryotes like protists, jellyfish, and other very simple organisms use this method of undergoing gas exchange and removing waste and obtaining nutrients and circulating those nutrients to all the cells that need it. One good example can be seen in jellyfish, where they have this gastrovascular cavity, and that can be seen here, this kind of cavity here in the center of their body. So they bring water, which has dissolved nutrients in it as well as dissolved oxygen, into the gastrovascular cavity via this shared hole, which is the mouth. And then once it's in that gastrovascular cavity, the oxygen and waste and nutrients and everything like that will simply diffuse from the water and the environment into the cells, and then waste will diffuse straight out of the cells into the media. And then any waste products are removed through that exact same hole out of the common mouth, anus, pore, back into the environment. For these organisms, that's a very simple process and it's very efficient. But as animals become more large and more complex, we don't have the luxury of being able to just undergo diffusion through our skin or through using a gastrovascular cavity. Instead, we have to use a system of vessels called the circulatory system to transport nutrients and oxygen, hormones, and cells and everything that we need to the tissues that need it, and to remove waste from our interstitial fluid. And then in addition to functioning in the transport of nutrients and gases, we also need the circulatory system to help us with thermoregulation. So we talked about this a little bit in the last presentation where we talked about homeostasis and how an animal can either contract or expand their blood vessels in order to help heat themselves or cool themselves off. So if you expand your blood vessels, you can allow for more heat to be released into the environment, and that will help cool you off. Or you can contract your blood vessels to help maintain heat within the body to keep you warm. And we also use our circulatory systems for protection against pathogens. So in our blood stream, we also have some immune cells that circulate through the body, and they help to attack any pathogens or cancerous cells that could potentially do harm to our bodies. So we have this system to help us with various aspects of daily life of being a large multicellular organism. There are two types of circulatory systems, open and closed. An open circulatory system is composed of a heart, a system of vessels, and a circulating fluid called hemolymph. And hemolymph is a mixture of the circulating fluid, which is the blood, and the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that surrounds the cells and the tissues. And how this process works is we'll start at the heart. That blood gets pumped from the heart through a system of vessels, and then it leaves the vessels to interact directly with the tissues. This is why the blood and the interstitial fluid become mixed, because the blood leaves the vessels to interact directly with the tissues and cells, and then it is eventually brought back to the heart via a system of vessels as well. And so this process is very common in more simple animals such as insects and mollusks, but it does not work so well for more complex or more active animals like humans. For humans and dolphins and octopi, we have a closed circulatory system. And a closed circulatory system is composed of a heart, a system of vessels, and a circulating fluid called blood. And how this works is blood is pumped from the heart through vessels called arteries to thinner vessels called capillaries, and then is returned to the heart via a system of vessels called veins. And this process means that blood constantly remains within the vessels. The blood does not leave the vessels at any point. So this means that the blood and the interstitial fluid are always kept separate. One really important set of vessels are these depicted here in this picture. which are the capillaries. This is the site of where gas, nutrient, and waste exchange occurs. And it occurs in this region due to diffusion. And we'll talk about this process in a lot more detail in some upcoming slides. And as I mentioned, this closed circulatory system is common in vertebrates because we're far more active, but it's also common in some invertebrates like octopi who have a more active lifestyle. There are a couple of different types of closed circulatory systems that vertebrates can have, but before we get into some details on those, I want to make sure there's some vocabulary that we all understand. First term is atrium, and the atrium is a chamber of the heart that is responsible for collecting the blood. This usually is on the top or the anterior region of the heart, and you can see that in this picture here. This space at the top of the heart is the atrium. And then the second term are ventricles. And ventricles are the chamber that lies beneath the atrium, and it's responsible for pumping the blood to the gills, lungs, or to any place in the body it needs to go. So as we're going through, you'll hear these terms quite a bit, so keep those definitions in mind. So we're going to begin looking at the closed circulatory systems in vertebrates by looking at the system in fish. Fish have a single circuit circulatory system, and the key defining thing about their circulatory system is that their heart only has two chambers. So this picture up here is actually a artist's rendition of what a two-chambered heart looks like, and they have the upper atrium and then a lower ventricle. So one atrium, one ventricle in their heart. And the flow of blood starts at the atrium where blood is collected, then it travels to the ventricle, and the ventricle pumps the blood all the way to the gills, where the deoxygenated blood is oxygenated, which is why this image goes from blue to red. It's something to keep in mind. Anytime you see blue and you're talking about the circulatory system, it represents deoxygenated blood, and red represents oxygenated blood. So the oxygenated blood then travels through a system of vessels to whatever tissues need to that oxygen. And the tissues is where they are deoxygenated and travel back to the blood via the system of vessels. The single circuit closed circulatory system of fish is very different from the two-circuit closed circulatory system that we see in mammals and birds. One major difference is the fact that our hearts are structurally different. So in fish, they had two chambers, one atria, one ventricle. In mammals and birds, we have four chambers. We have two atria, so one here and one here, and we have two ventricles, one here and one here. And we also have two circuits. So in fish, they had one circuit. You go from the heart to the lungs to the tissues back to the heart. In mammals and birds, we have two circuits. We have a pulmonary circuit that runs from the heart to the lungs back to the heart, and we have a systemic circuit that runs from the heart to the tissues back to the heart. And this allows for us to restore the blood pressure in our vessels that fish cannot do. Fish only have one chance to push the blood through their vessels, so it starts at a high blood pressure after it leaves the heart and goes through the gills, but as it continues through the vessels into the tissues and back to the heart, it slows down. So the blood pressure on the way back to the heart is really, really low. But in mammals and birds, we have two chances. So we can apply pressure to the bloodstream when the blood leaves the heart, and then apply more pressure to push all the blood that we need to get to all the extremities in our bodies. And how the flow of blood works in a closed circulatory system when we have mammals and birds is we start with blood entering into the right atrium. And from the right atrium, it flows to the right ventricle and then out to the lungs. And in the lungs is where the deoxygenated blood will become oxygenated, hence the reason why it goes from blue to red in this picture. And then the oxygenated blood then travels back to the heart and enters into the left atrium. And then from the left atrium, it flows into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle pumps the blood out of the heart into the vessels to go to the tissues. And at the tissues is where the blood will be deoxygenated, which is why it goes from red to blue in this picture. And that deoxygenation occurs in the capillaries, which is where gas exchange occurs. And then the deoxygenated blood will travel back to the heart via the veins and enter into the right atrium. So that's the system as it goes. If you don't follow this so far, it's okay. We're going to go through it in a lot more detail in a couple of slides. There's yet another closed circulatory system that we see in vertebrates, and this system is used by reptiles and amphibians. Reptiles and amphibians also have a two-circuit system, but the key difference between their system and the system of mammals and birds is that their heart has 3 chambers instead of 4. So we have chamber here, 1, 2 atria, and then 1 large ventricle that's shared for both the atria. And this ventricle is usually not septated, so there is no separation between the left and right half. Some reptiles might have a little bit of a separation between the sides, but for the most part, it's just 1 large ventricle chamber. And so you would think that this would be problematic because the deoxygenated blood and the oxygenated blood would mix. But what they actually find is, for some reason, the 2 types of blood barely mix. So their 3-chambered heart functions very similarly to the 4-chambered heart that we see in mammals and birds. And as I mentioned, it is a 2-circuit system. So they do have a pulmonary circuit that runs from the heart to the lungs back to the heart, and a systemic circuit that runs from the heart to the tissues back to the heart. And the flow of blood in this closed circulatory system is very similar to what we saw in mammals and birds. We start with deoxygenated blood entering in at the right atrium and then traveling to the shared ventricle. And then from the ventricle, it's pumped to the lungs to become oxygenated. So it goes from blue to red in this image because now it's oxygenated once it's red. And then the oxygenated blood travels back to the heart and enters in the left atrium, and then travels back down to the shared ventricle, and then is pumped out of the ventricle to the tissues where the blood is deoxygenated at the capillaries, and then travels back to the heart via the veins and enters back into the right atrium. So this is very, very similar to the pathway that we see in mammals and birds. It's just that their heart has 3 chambers instead of 4. Now let's take a closer look at this 2-circuit system. We'll begin with the pulmonary circuit. So in the pulmonary circuit, we'll start with deoxygenated blood entering the heart. Deoxygenated blood from the head and arms will enter the heart via the superior vena cava, which is shown here. And then deoxygenated blood from every region that's below the arms will enter into the heart via the inferior vena cava. Here. The deoxygenated blood will collect in the right atrium, and then it will flow from the right atrium to the right ventricle. Once the blood has traveled to the right ventricle, there's a valve located here. Oh, let's do white. There's a valve contained right here that will close. And that valve helps to prevent blood from backflowing from the ventricle into the atrium once the ventricle contracts. That valve closing actually makes a noise that you can hear when you hear someone's heartbeat. It's the lub noise when you hear people's heart that goes lub dub. That's that noise, is that valve closing. And so then the right ventricle will contract and it will push the blood from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. And once this contraction is complete, there's another valve that's located here that will close. And when this valve closes, it makes that dub noise that you hear in lub dub, right? And so this prevents backflow of deoxygenated blood from the pulmonary artery back into the ventricle, because if it backflows, that can cause problems. So then the blood travels from the pulmonary artery, and then the pulmonary artery will branch into 2 sides, creating the right and left pulmonary arteries. They both just go to the right and left lungs, so they basically do the same thing. So we'll just follow the right pulmonary artery from now. So the blood travels from the right pulmonary artery to the lungs and becomes oxygenated. Then the oxygenated blood travels back to the heart via the pulmonary vein and empties into the left atrium. And this is the entirety of the pulmonary circuit. The left atrium will also collect blood from both pulmonary veins. So we'll begin looking at the systemic circuit at the left atrium. So the oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins collects in the left atrium, and then it will flow from the left atrium to the left ventricle. Once blood has flown from the atrium to the ventricle, Then we have the same type of valve like we saw on the other side of the heart will close. And that's also that lub noise. So both of the atrial valves close at the same time, which is that lub noise. And then once the blood has been transferred to the ventricle will contract, and that will push blood from the ventricles into the aorta. And once the blood has been pushed into the aorta, we also have a valve here that will close, and that's also that dub noise. And that prevents the backflow of oxygenated blood from the aorta into the ventricles. And so then there is a sharp turn in the aorta called the aortic arch. And then we keep going down the aorta, and the aorta will eventually branch into two branches. One branch will send oxygenated blood to the head and arms, where the other branch will send oxygenated blood to all the other tissues of the body. So the blood travels down the arteries to the various tissues that need oxygen. And then from the arteries, it'll get filtered into capillaries, and we'll talk about more about capillaries in a minute. But then this is the area where gas exchange will occur, as well as nutrient exchange and waste exchange. And so in the cases of gases, this is where the blood becomes deoxygenated, and then the deoxygenated blood will leave the capillaries, go back to the veins, enter into the superior or inferior vena cava, and then travel back to the heart. And that completes the circuit. We obviously need a force to push this blood through the vessels and through the circulatory system. And this force is the heartbeat. And the heartbeat is monitored or regulated by something called the sinoatrial node. And that can be seen in this picture up here. The sinoatrial node is a piece of modified muscle tissue that's located on the right atrium that basically fires on its own. So unlike most muscle tissue that needs neuronal stimulation in order to contract, this piece of muscle tissue just contracts spontaneously at regular intervals by itself. And this is what causes your heart, that stimulates the heartbeat for the entirety of your life. And so how this works is the sinoatrial node will send an electrical pulse down through the right atrium, and then that impulse will travel to the left atrium. And then once it reaches the left atrium, that will cause both atria to contract. And that contraction is what helps to push the blood that's pooled in the atrium into the ventricles. And then the electrical impulse then travels down the center of the heart to the bottom of the heart. And it kind of like bounces off the bottom of the heart. It starts to travel back up the ventricles, the sides of the ventricles. As it's traveling back up the ventricles, it will send that impulse to the ventricle muscles to contract. And this is what will contract the ventricles to send the blood to the pulmonary artery or to the aortas. And so this process just continues over and over. So the sinoatrial node sends electrical impulses from the right atrium to the left atrium. They both contract. Then that impulse will be sent down the center of the heart to the bottom of the heart. Then it will travel back up from the bottom of the heart, causing the ventricles to contract, and that pushes the blood from the bottom of the ventricles up and out through the pulmonary artery or the aorta, and then the impulse dissipates, and then we start again. And that's how your heart beats for your entire life. Now that we talked about the heart, the heartbeat, and the flow of blood through the circulatory system, let's spend some time talking about the vessels that make up the circulatory system. There are 3 types of vessels, and we'll begin with the arteries. So the arteries are responsible for carrying blood away from the heart. And they're composed of 3 tissue types. We have a layer of epithelial tissue, which is the yellow layer in this image, followed by a layer of smooth tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and then a layer of connective tissue. And when you combine all these tissue layers together, it gives the arteries a pretty thick wall. But even though this wall is thick, it's pretty flexible. And that's important for the flow of blood through the system, because as the heart beats, it applies pressure to those vessels. And this will cause the vessels to expand and then recoil, and expand and recoil. And as they do that, it helps to push the blood through the arteries to the capillaries and the various tissues that need oxygenation. And when you go to get your blood pressure taken, or if you take your own blood pressure or take someone else's blood pressure, when you're doing this, you're actually measuring the pressure of the blood against the arteries. And there are two measurements when you're doing a blood pressure reading. There's the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure. The systolic pressure is measuring the pressure of the push of the blood from the heartbeat and that pressure against the arterial walls. So this is the pressure of the heart contracting and pushing the blood. And then the diastolic reading is the measurement of the pressure against the arterial walls as the blood passively flows through the arteries. And generally for healthy people, you want your systolic, diastolic readings to be approximately 120/80. If you get too high or too low from this reading, it can be problematic. And so what will happen is as the arteries are traveling through the body, they will branch off, and as they're branching, they become thinner and thinner. So you can see that really well in this picture here. You can see how these arteries start out pretty thick, and then you can see some of them get thinner and thinner and thinner. And these arteries will branch and become thinner and become what are called arterioles. And the arterioles will continue to branch and become thinner until they become capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest and thinnest vessels in the body. They're actually so small and thin that blood cells can only travel through the capillaries one at a time. You can see that in these two pictures here. It's a little bit harder to see in this upper picture, but these are all capillaries, and these red dots here are the blood cells. So the blood cells you can see are clearly lined up one at a time, single file, traveling through the capillaries. You can also see it here as well. Each of these red dots is a blood cell, a red blood cell, traveling through the capillaries. And so as the blood is traveling through the capillaries, it slows down, right? Because it's not rushing through anymore. They have to travel single file. So it slows down, and this allows for the exchange of nutrients and gas and waste to occur between the interstitial fluid of the tissues and the fluid flowing through the bloodstream. And generally, capillaries are organized into like kind of like a mass or a mesh of capillaries around various tissues. And so that's why oftentimes you'll see them drawn like this in diagrams, is because there is no one capillary. It's a meshwork of capillaries that surround the tissues to allow for effective exchange of nutrients and gases. The last vessels we have are the veins, and veins are the vessels that run from distant areas of the body to the heart. The structure of veins is very similar to what we see as the structure of arteries. They have a epithelial layer of tissue, followed by a layer of smooth muscle, and then a layer of connective tissue. But the big difference here is that the layer of smooth muscle in the veins is much thinner than the layer of smooth muscle in the arteries. And this allows them to have a thinner wall to them, and it allows them to be more expandable. So they're a lot more flexible, if you will, than the arteries are. But by the time the blood reaches the veins, the blood pressure has significantly decreased, right? So the pressure has now drastically decreased due to the fact that the blood slowed down in the capillaries. And so in order to pump the blood from the veins back to the heart, we need some extra assistance. And the assistance is from your skeletal muscles. So the skeletal muscles that are nearest to the veins help to apply pressure to the veins and pushes, basically squeezes the blood up the veins until it gets back to your heart. And to help with this process, the veins have these kind of valves here. You can see them here. And these valves help to prevent the blood from kind of rushing back in the opposite direction. So there's regular valves at intervals throughout the veins, and then the blood gets kind of pushed up to the next valve, sits there, gets pushed up, sits, until eventually it gets back to the heart. And then the heart will restore the blood pressure in the arteries to circulate through the body. This is why it's problematic if you sit for long periods of time without moving your muscles, because the blood in your veins will pool there and it can cause some serious problems. This is why you should always get up and walk around if you've been sitting for a long period of time. And the veins are generally closer to the skin than your arteries are. They're a lot more expendable than the arteries are. So if you ever accidentally cut a vein, which is mostly what you end up cutting by accident if you get injured, the blood will seep. But if you accidentally cut an artery, the blood will spurt out, which is really, really problematic for humans. So generally, we protect our arteries by putting them closer into the body than we do our veins. You've already heard me say the term blood several times in this presentation, and you probably think you already know what blood is. But blood is actually far more complicated than what you might think. It's a composition of a lot of different cells and liquids and compounds that all come together to allow it to circulate in the body and also perform the various functions that it needs to do. So one of the major components of blood is plasma. And plasma is the liquid, watery part of the blood that allows it to kind of flow. Plasma makes up the extracellular matrix of the blood, and it's composed of dissolved metabolites, proteins, salts, ions, water, and various other compounds that are traveling through the vessels. And plasma is also the primary carrier of CO2 from the tissues to the lungs. So the CO2 is primarily dissolved in the plasma so it can be transported to the lungs and removed from the body. The blood also has platelets, and platelets are cellular fragments from these large cells that are contained in the bone marrow called megakaryocytes. Basically, these megakaryocytes break off parts of their cytoplasm that are released into the bloodstream, and those are platelets. And platelets are basically packets of enzymes and compounds that are responsible for patching damaged vessels. So when you get a cut, they're the first ones to the scene that help to cause a clotting and kind of seal that wound up so you don't continue to bleed forever and ever, right? And when they encounter that the edge of that wounded vessel, they basically stick to that vessel, and then they release other compounds that will recruit more platelets to that vessel so they can patch that hole, patch that wound until your body can start making more connective tissue and actually having a more repair, permanent repair of the damaged vessel. Then we also have white blood cells, or WBCs, as you'll see me write many times in this presentation. And white blood cells are composed of 5 different types of immune cells. It's not just one type of cell. And they can diffuse out of the capillaries to fight various infections and to help get rid of cancer cells. And then the largest cell type of blood are the red blood cells, or RBCs. And they're very, very short-lived. They only last a couple of months and then they're replenished. They have no nucleus, no mitochondria, and no protein-making machinery. They're basically bags of protein that are responsible for carrying oxygen around. And this is why they're short-lived. They don't have, if they get damaged, they have no way of fixing themselves because they don't make any proteins or enzymes or anything to fix any damage. So once they're damaged, they get removed from the body and quickly replaced. And when I said they're bags of proteins, one of these main, most important proteins that they have is called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is the oxygen carrying protein of blood that allows it to ferry oxygen all around the body. Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are all made in the bone marrow. So all of your immune cells, red blood cells, and these fragments that help you to heal are all made in your bones. So this is one reason why it's really important to make sure you take care of your bones because they're more than just your skeletal system. Red blood cells are involved in one of the most critical processes that an animal must undergo, and that's gas exchange. There are 2 types of gas exchanges that occur in animals. We have an exchanges between the external environment and the circulatory system, and then exchanges between the circulatory system and the cells and tissues that make up the animal. In order for gas exchange to occur, a couple of requirements must be met. One, there must be a respiratory organ. Some examples are lungs and gills, but there are some other examples out there like trachea and the skin. Various animals will use various organs for respiration. And then we have to have a respiratory medium. And this is the medium that will basically ferry the gases to and from. And this can be water or air. And then we need a moist surface. And the moist surface is where gases will become dissolved and the actual exchange will occur. Gas exchange in vertebrates is facilitated by hemoglobin and red blood cells. Hemoglobin is a protein that's composed of 4 other proteins or polypeptides, and that can be seen in this picture here. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4. And red blood cells are packed with millions of this hemoglobin protein. And the hemoglobin has iron located at the center of each of those polypeptides. So for each hemoglobin, there are 4 iron molecules. And in this picture, they have them drawn as these yellow circles. These are all the iron. And it's showing you here, this is the iron. And then each of those iron molecules can bind an oxygen molecule from the lungs and then ferry that oxygen molecule to the tissues. And so you can see that as well here in this picture. The orange is the oxygen. The hemoglobin does not bind oxygen very, very tightly, so that this allows for oxygen to come into the hemoglobin and to be released from the hemoglobin when necessary. And so this whole process of oxygen being uptaken into the hemoglobin and then being released is all facilitated by oxygen concentrations. So oxygen concentration in the lungs is much higher than it is in the circulatory system in deoxygenated blood. This causes the blood to uptake oxygen from the lungs via the alveoli, which we'll talk about in a second. And then as the blood travels to the tissues, the concentration of oxygen in the tissues is much lower than the concentration of oxygen in the blood. And this will cause the oxygen to move by diffusion from the blood into the tissues. And this is how oxygen is ferried throughout the body. Vertebrates tend to use either gills or lungs as their primary respiratory organ, with gills being prevalent in aquatic vertebrates such as fish. But gills are not exclusive to fish. There are also a lot of aquatic invertebrates such as clams and shrimp that also have gills. And in these aquatic animals, their respiratory medium is water. Well, one problem with water is that it doesn't have as much oxygen saturation as air. The amount of oxygen in water is only 5% of what you would find in air. So fish and other aquatic animals that have gills need to be able to extract as much oxygen from the water as they possibly can. And they do this by absorbing water as it flows past their gills. So you can see that in this picture here, where each of these plates represents a part of the gills. And water is brought past the gills in these kind of spaces between them. So you can see this is the blue is the water flowing through and past the gills. And as water passes by the gills, the capillaries in the gills, which are shown here, will absorb as much oxygen as possible and release as much CO2 as possible into that water before it passes and leaves the gills. And how they're able to optimize as much oxygen as they can from the water is through a process called countercurrent exchange system. And this is where the blood travels in the opposite direction of the water flow. And this allows them to extract up to 85% of the dissolved oxygen that's available in the water. So it's pretty efficient. And so to explain how this process works and why it's so efficient, we're going to take a look at these 2 images. So if the blood flow went in the same direction as the water flow, the oxygen saturation would reach equilibrium very quickly, and the fish could only absorb 50% of the available oxygen in the water. And this is why. So we know that everything is based on concentration gradients. Everything goes from high concentration to low concentration. And if you have, let's say for this hypothetical example, 100% oxygen saturation in the water, and you had 0% oxygen in your blood, right? And they're flowing in the same direction. As long as the concentration of oxygen is higher in the water than in the blood, then the oxygen will diffuse passively from the water into the bloodstream and be available to the fish. So that happens at the very early stages in this concurrent flow. So we have from 100 to 0%, we're flowing into the blood, which is great. But then we realize we get to a problem, we get to about 50% saturation of oxygen. When there's 50% of the oxygen in the water and 50% of the oxygen in the tissues, we've now reached equilibrium. So there will no longer be any oxygen being brought into the tissues because everything is equal. And this is problematic, right? They would suffocate. So they needed to find a way to extract as much oxygen as possible, far more than 50% from the water. To do this, they orient their blood flow in the opposite direction of the water flow. And so this allows for there always to be a higher concentration of oxygen in the water than there is in the vessels. So you can constantly pull out more and more oxygen. So if you look at it at this picture down here, let's say we had an example of 100% of the oxygen saturation for the water. Even at 90% saturation in the blood, it's still higher. So there will still be more passive diffusion of oxygen from the water into the blood. And that continues as water flows and more oxygen is being released. The amount of oxygen present in the blood is always lower than the amount of oxygen present in the water. So we're always going to be extracting as much oxygen as we can from the water as it passes by the gills. Terrestrial vertebrates and aquatic vertebrates whose ancestors were terrestrial, such as dolphins and whales, use lungs as their primary respiratory organ. And we use air as our primary respiratory medium. So how respiration occurs in the lungs begins at the mouth and nose. Air is brought into the mouth and nose and is pushed back to the pharynx. From the pharynx, the air travels down the trachea to the bronchi. At the end of the bronchi, there's a branching, and it'll branch left and right. And this leads to the left and right lung. After this branching, the bronchi continue to branch and branch and branch. And as they're branching, they become smaller and smaller and thinner, and so they become bronchioles. And the bronchioles end in an air-filled sac called alveoli or alveoli. And the alveoli are covered in capillaries, and this is the site of gas exchange. So oxygen is brought into the alveoli, and it's very moist in there. And that moisture allows for the oxygen to become dissolved. And once the oxygen is dissolved, it will diffuse past the alveoli wall, past the capillary wall, and into the bloodstream. Once in the bloodstream, hemoglobin in the red blood cells will pick up that oxygen and ferry it through to wherever it needs to go. And then how CO2 is exchanged works in a very similar way. The CO2 that's present in the bloodstream will diffuse past the capillary wall, past the alveoli wall to join the air in the air sacs. And when you exhale, that air travels out of those air sacs through the bronchioles, through the bronchi, up the trachea, past the pharynx, and then out of your body through your nose and mouth. So I just mentioned exhaling. We all know we need to inhale and exhale in order to breathe, but how does this process work? There are two sets of muscles that are involved in inhalation and exhalation, and those are your intercostal muscles, which are the muscles located between your ribs, and your diaphragm, which is a large sheet of muscle that lies between your chest cavity and your abdominal cavity. So when you want to inhale, these muscles will contract. When the diaphragm contracts, it pulls the diaphragm down towards the abdominal cavity. And you can see that in this picture when you compare this image to this one, right? You can see it's far more further down. But in addition to your diaphragm contracting, your intercostal muscles also contract. And when they contract, it causes you to lift your rib cage. So that is those intercostal muscles contracting. And when both of these muscles contract, it causes your chest cavity to expand. So this region here is now much larger. And then when you exhale, that's when your muscles, both those muscles, relax. So when your intercostal muscles relax, your rib cage goes back down. When your diaphragm relaxes, then it goes kind of back up into its normal position. And this causes the chest cavity to return to normal, which is a lot smaller. And when it returns back to normal, that pushes all of the extra air out of the lungs into the environment. And so this is how inhalation and exhalation works. Thus far in this presentation, we've been talking about the cardiovascular system, but we have another circulatory system in vertebrates as well, the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system is an open network of vessels that supports the cardiovascular system. And it actually runs alongside the cardiovascular system as well. But instead of carrying blood, it ferries a clear liquid derived from interstitial fluid called lymph. And the lymph is pumped through the vessels of the lymphatic system, similar to how the deoxygenated blood or blood is pumped through the veins. So it's pumped through by the movement of your skeletal muscles, putting pressure on the lymph vessels to push the fluid through the system. There is no heart for the lymphatic system. And so there are a couple of different functions that the lymphatic system plays. One, it's responsible for recovering recycled fluid that is lost when there's an exchange between the blood and the interstitial fluid. And it basically recycles that fluid and proteins that are lost back into the circulatory system. And you can see that in this picture here. It's showing you that these are the vessels, right? This mesh here, and these are the capillaries. And then this white tissue here, this white vein looking thing here, is your lymphatic vessel. And the lymphatic vessel is open, right? So it's not a closed system. So these open tubes will uptake the interstitial fluid, and then it will take that interstitial fluid and pump it all the way back to vessels near your shoulder, and then it will dump that interstitial fluid back into your circulatory system to join with the blood. And so if this process does not occur, you end up with something like this, where you get massive edema in the tissues where the interstitial fluid is constantly being lost. Fluid is being lost from the circulatory system, but it's not being recycled. It just keeps getting pushed further and further into the tissues, and you get a lot of swelling. So this is important when it comes to that, preventing this swelling from occurring. Also, the lymphatic system have these nodules called lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes are packed with white blood cells. And when the fluid flows through the lymph nodes, the white blood cells attack any pathogens that are in that fluid and destroy them, as well as any cancer cells that are in that fluid as well. And this helps to protect you from various pathogens, as well as developing cancer or preventing cancer from metastasizing. And then the lymphatic system is also responsible for helping to absorb lipids and other nutrients from the digestive tract and putting them into the bloodstream. So your gut is surrounded by a lot of lymphatic vessels, and they will allow for the uptake of lipids, and then they will transport those lipids back into your circulatory system so that they can, and other nutrients as well, so they can be circulated throughout the body to the various tissues that need it. With the circulatory and respiratory systems being as crucial as they are to an animal's survival, you can imagine if something goes wrong, it can be pretty detrimental. And so I've listed here a couple of illnesses and diseases that are associated with the circulatory system and respiratory system when something doesn't go according to plan. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but there are a few that I wanted to point out. One being heart murmurs. So heart murmurs occur when the valves in the heart that are responsible for preventing blood from backflowing in the wrong direction do not close completely. So you get a little bit of blood that flows back in the wrong direction. And whenever you hear someone say, oh, that I have a heart murmur, that's what's happening. This is generally not life-threatening, but if enough blood flows back in the wrong direction, it can cause some serious problems. We also have things like anemia. Anemia is relatively common nowadays. It's more common in women than men due to menstruation, but it is also present in men. And it's commonly due to the fact that there are too few blood cells in the body, a lot of times due to an iron deficiency, but it can also be due to the fact that you've lost too much blood. So you can't adequately get oxygen to the tissues that you need. This can often lead to lethargy and fatigue. Then we also have hypertension. Hypertension is one of the major causes of morbidity and mortality in the United States, and it's when your blood pressure is over 120/80. And this can result in a loss of elasticity in your blood vessels, which is problematic because you need that elasticity to help push the blood through the system. Without that elasticity, it puts a lot more strain on your heart to pump the blood, and this can lead to a heart attack or a stroke. And then we have, of course, heart attacks and strokes. A heart attack is an interruption in the blood flow in the coronary artery. So the coronary artery is the artery that's responsible for feeding blood and oxygen directly to your heart. And if there is a blood clot that forms in that artery, then your heart cannot get the oxygen that it needs, and it will either beat irregularly or will cease beating altogether. And this is what we see as a heart attack. And then we also have strokes. And a stroke is a blockage of a blood vessel in the vein. I mean, in the brain, sorry. So when a blood clot forms in a vessel in the brain, it will allow for a lack of oxygen in that region, and this is what results as a stroke. And then we have sickle cell disease. And sickle cell disease is when your red blood cells that are normally round shaped become shaped like a C, like a moon shape. And this is problematic because, one, those cells cannot ferry oxygen properly to the various tissues, so you're not getting as much oxygen as your body needs. But these C-shaped cells also tend to stick together, and this can enhance your chances of getting blood clotting. And as we've just talked about, blood clots in your body are not a good thing, so that can lead to heart attacks and strokes depending on where these blood clots occur. Okay, with that said, we've reached the end of our respiratory and circulatory system lecture. Go ahead and read chapter 22 with a focus on sections 1 through 6, section 8, sections 11 through 15, and section 17. You're more than welcome to read the other sections of the chapter, but if you're low on time, I recommend just focusing in on these areas. You can also go ahead and do the chapter 22 learning curve assignment. And then I've included some videos here that may be helpful with visualizing some of these concepts. The respiration in fish, I would say minute 1.5 to 2 minutes and 25 seconds is probably the most relevant to this course. And then some of these other videos may have a little bit more detail than what we're going through in class. So be sure to just match up the information you need from the videos to what we've covered in the lecture, but they are pretty helpful at visualizing some things and understanding the content. Okay, I'll see you in the next lecture where we're going to talk about nutrition and digestion.